I'm going to try and contextualise what happened at Grenfell within this period and climate of austerity. Obviously, you know, it's becoming increasingly common knowledge now that austerity is now one of the biggest killers in our country, and is actually a global epidemic, killing hundreds of thousands of people in other austerity climates internationally. And like Pilgrim had already discussed and highlighted, we have a lot of policies which historically helped to build the system of protection, our welfare state, municipal housing, which started in the 1920s in Glasgow. Sorry, probably it did. And now all of that's been dismantled under this period of austerity, has been dismantled over the past 30, 40 years, let's face it, right? Austerity is not the first economic period in which to dismantle our levels of social protection and housing and welfare and health and safety protection. But certainly the dismantling of these forms of social protection is increasing under austerity to a point now where it is affecting individual people's lives, and it's affecting the health and safety of hundreds of thousands of tenants all over. So that's kind of the basis in which I'm going to be, that's kind of the lens through which I'll be talking about Grenfell. Since, I think it's important to highlight as well, since 2010, since our austerity measures come into effect post-financial crash, we've seen a litany of housing policies that have systematically targeted council housing and social housing tenants, such as the tenants at Grenfell Tower. Bedroom tax, benefit caps, insecure tenancies, cuts to council housing and social housing by 60%, to be replaced with the affordable housing model, which means that tenants on low income are forced to pay 80% of the market rate in London. That's just unfeasible, completely impractical and impossible. And we've also seen these cuts not just in the housing, we've not just seen such policies in housing and affecting housing tenants, we've seen cuts also made to the enforcement of health and safety inspections, of fire regulation inspections as well, and obviously Steve would have spoke more about that had he been here, and it would have been great to hear that, and he talks about that a lot, so please, you know, follow Steve and look up his work for more on the cuts to to health and safety enforcement and fire regulation. And essentially, austerity by default is about cutting back on public expenditure, cutting back on public services. It's about implementing fiscal discipline in public sector areas, while at the same time boosting the private sector economy. So austerity, therefore, is it's perpetuated by this myth, by this lie, that money will trickle down from our welfare neighbours, that businesses in the private sector will be able to fund our vital public services. Meanwhile, the providers of the public services, such as our local authorities, since 2010 have had to implement cost-cutting programmes. And you'll see, as I go through this talk, we'll see how these kind of policies and austerity projects play out and form a central part in the build-up to Grenfell, not only in the build-up but also in the aftermath of Grenfell. So we know, Pilgrim gave us some insight, we know that the regeneration of Grenfell Tower was primarily a vanity project. It was a facelift that predominantly involved new cladding. It was to raise the profile of the tower within the area to make it more aesthetically pleasing to the surrounding neighbours. And the Kensington and Chelsea Borough said that the cladding would not only improve the exterior of the building, would not only make it more aesthetically pleasing, but would also make the homes inside more energy efficient. It would also cut individual energy costs to the households. And upon its completion, the Kensington Chelsea Borough were very self-congratulating upon the completion of the Grenfell Tower. Very self-congratulating. It's in all their newsletters, look it up, and it's in the Resident Action Group. They said, and this is Nicholas Paget Brown, "It is remarkable to see firsthand how the cladding has lifted the external appearance of the tower." And then KCTMO also followed this up. "This regeneration has improved the homes overall, and residents can now have the benefits of living in energy efficient homes, all in a vastly improved environment. The whole project was done within budget." Now, meanwhile, from 2010 to 2017, the Kensington and Chelsea Borough repeatedly reminded its residents that it had to enforce this cost-cutting programme because of the constraints of austerity. They had to say, they said to tenants frequently that they were committed to a demanding programme of savings and had been committed to a cost-cutting programme and rolled that out across the borough. So essentially they were very pleased with their achievements of the regeneration of Grenfell Tower, because while they were under these pressures of austerity, they were also able to carry out this regeneration, right? So pat on the back to Kensington and Chelsea Borough and the KCTMO. And the cost-cutting programme also, obviously, we know now, affected the regeneration of the Grenfell Tower. RKCB, or rather KCTMO, the tenants' the management organisation, were in charge of the tendering, were in charge of the contracting out of the management of the regeneration. And initially Leadbitter, one of the construction companies, they were thought to be one of the best companies to contract to. But when they quoted 11-point-something million for the contracts, KCTMO, the tenant management organisation, decided to give the contract to Ryden. Why? Because Ryden offered a cheaper value. Ryden offered 8.7 million. So in terms of the cost-cutting exercise that was being rolled out, this meant that by going with Ryden, the borough could therefore save costs, right? It could save £1.6 million. Then, of course, the cost-cutting continues, and we know this now as well. Cost-cutting continues into the subcontractors. Harley Facades, who installed the cladding. Harley Facades, a subcontractor, decided to use cheaper cladding, a more flammable type of cladding, because ultimately it was less expensive and helped to reduce cost ultimately by £5,000. And don't forget, in all of this, outsourcing itself is a form of cost cutting. Okay, that's the myth. But outsourcing itself is a form of cost cutting in this austerity and also New Labour period as well. At the height of our austerity period, we're living in the reality where our local authorities are simply just commissioners. They're just parent commissioners who commission out service delivery to multiple different private agencies. So the regeneration of Grenfell Tower involved outsourcing and contracting out to approximately 78 companies. In the 1980s or the 1970s, local authorities would have had their own architecture department. Local authorities would have carried out those regeneration projects from in-house, and they would have carried out the inspection of those projects as well from in-house. But instead of architecture departments today, what we've got is departments of procurement and contracting. So, of course, with this type of cost cutting, no one looks at the risks. They only look at the books. And when the Grenfell regeneration project was completed, the Kensington and Chelsea Borough, again, they blew their own trumpet. They were very self-congratulating. They said, the cost reduction programme has been so successful, it has exceeded its savings targets for 2013 to 2014, producing a surplus, right? Here's the interesting part, some of you may already know. Kensington and Chelsea Borough didn't have to roll out its cost-cutting programme. It actually had £270 million in surplus. There was no deficit in Kensington and Chelsea Borough, so why did it have to roll out its cost-cutting programme? Why did it have to cut costs on the regeneration project? So this is why, so they were hugely euphoric, right? At the time of austerity, all local authorities are falling under, and they're actually afloat. I mean, they're really wealthy, and they're really satisfied with their projects, with their financial management. And it wasn't only the council who were euphoric and quite self-congratulating about their achievements and their financial management. Their financial management was also kind of rubber stamped. It was also approved by the American credit rating agency called Standard & Poor. The council had AAA credit rating from between 2011 to 2016. And also the local authority inspectorate, the KPMG, nonetheless, one of the big four auditing and accountant companies, said that they were completely satisfied with Kensington and Chelsea Borough and how they were doing in the procurement and contracting department. And they said they were satisfied that Kensington and Chelsea put in place proper arrangements to secure economy, efficiency and effectiveness in its use of resources for the year ended March 2016. So basically the borough was given the all clear, and it was being rubber stamped in terms of how it was performing in its contractual management and also within its financial management. And just to come back again to Pilgrim, of course, while all this was happening, as the financial regulators and the council officers were keeping their eyes on the finances, Grenfell tenants were complaining in their droves to the KCTMO, the tenant management organisation, about the fire risks, the electrical failures, the exposed pipes and so on. And as Pilgrim says, read the Resident Action Group blog, it's so insightful, and start chronologically as well. Because of the two-tier system of the TMO, it meant that the management of the stock was managed by the TMO, it wasn't managed by the council. So tenants had to go through the TMO first and foremost, and that's why there is this conflict with the TMO, and that's why we keep hearing about and the centrality of TMO in the Grenfell story. In housing law, the idea is that with a TMO, housing authorities can operate more efficiently. Why? Because a TMO can conduct the everyday management of housing, can actually do the frontline work, the everyday management, the responding to tenants, etc., while the local housing authorities themselves can get on with housing business, housing strategy, housing finance. So in housing law, the TMO, the two-tier system, is supposed to be a more efficient system. So the TMO deals with the management and the local housing authority deals with the housing business. And again, as Pilgrim said, TMOs should be for small estates. They should only be for a couple of hundred housing units. But somehow, KCTMO ended up the biggest TMO in England with 10,000 housing units. How that happened, I'm sure, Pilgrim, you've got a much more interesting story to tell. But TMOs and also arm's length management organisations, they actually stem from the privatised model of housing, even though they were introduced before the 1980s. There's plenty of arguments and plenty of activists also in boroughs and local councils, especially in London, who will argue that TMOs are part of the privatised model of housing because they help to shift the ownership of the day-to-day management away from the council and into an autonomous body, the TMO. And even though the autonomous body is a not-for-profit body, it nevertheless helps, it still helps to put in place the structural foundations for beginning the process of privatisation, for beginning the process of the stock transfer, all of these types of privatised housing practices that we're seeing today. And this is why central governments love TMOs. TMOs give the veneer of tenant participation, of community ownership, of this idea that everyday tenants can have, some say in their how they're managed. But of course the reality is, and especially for the Grenfell tenants, the reality is that there's no such participation, there's still a centrality of power. KCTMO, according to the Grenfell Residents Action Group, operated like a mini mafia, meaning that there was a centrality of power and they chose who to speak to and who not to speak to. But the other specific issue with the TMO, and TMOs generally, is because they're an autonomous body, and this goes back to the privatised housing model, there's no accountability, there's no transparency, and there's no similar accountability transparency checks as you get with a local housing authority. So when the Residents Action Group kept on going to KCTMO and saying, we need information, how are you running, how are you operating, we need to know, we want transparency, KCTMO refused it. And when the Residents Group went down the freedom of information route to get information, KCTMO replied, because the TMO is not a public authority defined by the Freedom of Information Act, it does not have a duty, therefore, to respond to information requests made under the FOI. So TMOs are part of that privatised model because, like the private sector, they lack accountability and they lack transparency, and they're very, very opaque systems. So just to make some final remarks, concluding remarks, Grenfell is the outcome of austerity. It happened within the context of austerity, but it's also, as Pilgrim rightly highlighted, it's also the culmination of decades of structural changes precipitated by the neoliberal housing policy, housing model. And the formation of unaccountable TMOs, housing stock transfers, regeneration initiatives, which are hugely corrupt, insecure tenancy contracts, etc. All of these policies and processes over the years has led to the stigmatisation, the vilifying and even the criminalising of council tenants. Tenants whose right to remain safe has been systematically undermined and ignored, with the devastating and utterly shocking consequences that we've seen at Grenfell. But it's really important to remember, and I think this is a point I've been trying to think about in the context of austerity. The tenants at Grenfell represent the same working class communities up and down the country who under austerity are being evicted, they're being displaced, they're being kicked out of their local communities en masse. They're being shoehorned into temporary accommodation, and in the worst case scenario, these are the types of tenants who right now, today, are under such psychological despair they simply cannot cope within the current austerity climate. The actual rate of suicides in this austerity period is unprecedented. In May this year, David White and myself recently published an edited collection called The Violence of Austerity. And the basic premise of the book was to highlight the ways in which austerity impacts upon people violently and harmfully. We wanted to say, essentially our main point was we wanted to say, right, okay, we know austerity causes and generates inequality. Now here's the evidence to show you how it affects people violently, how it physically impacts people, and how psychologically it impacts people as well. But the book was also a way for us to document the ways in which our everyday institutions now are also the enforcers of this violence, and I think this is important in the context of Grenfell as well. Our everyday institutions, like our local housing authorities, our local authority for building and housing regulation, our benefits agencies, etc. These agencies are all now tasked with enforcing the violence of austerity because of their cost-cutting programmes, because of the cost-cutting projects, and all of the insidious practices that involves, that I'm sure everybody's been reading about on a day-to-day basis, looking at people who've been removed from their benefits, etc. So essentially austerity is about dismantling our social protection. Yes, that's clear, that's not disputed, but it's doing with the effect in which it's actually physically and psychologically harming people. And evidently the violence of austerity is set to continue. Grenfell wasn't a point in which we actually looked at what's happening in order to improve things, in order to prevent this violence from unfolding. We're seeing in the case of Grenfell and its aftermath, we're still seeing tenants 5 months later, residents who are affected by the Grenfell fire, who are still living in temporary hotel accommodation, and they're still passed from pillar to post by their authorities. And essentially these families are just seen by these authorities as another statistic who count towards the enormous increase in the number of homeless families who are also living in temporary accommodation. They're just another statistic to the authorities who count towards the 170 people per day who are evicted, who are forcibly removed from their homes, especially within communities in London that probably Aditya is going to talk about. So essentially, when the residents from Lancaster West Estate are rehoused, they're not going to be exempt from the harmful housing policies that a number of people up and down the country are experiencing right now. They will still be subject to the bedroom tax, they'll still be subject to the benefit cap, and where their tenancy was probably secure before the cladding, they will probably be given an insecure tenancy wherever it is that they're moved to. So the final point I really want to make is this: austerity doesn't generate savings, austerity doesn't generate any savings to the economy whatsoever. It generates more cost to the economy. The idea that it generates savings is a lie. It's the lie and deception that austerity politics is built on. It costs more to house families in temporary accommodation than it does to provide them with stable accommodation, and it costs more in legal bills when local authorities try and remove people from their benefit entitlement, and it costs more in bills in terms of trying to pick up the pieces when those individuals are made destitute. And of course there is the human cost of austerity as well, and that's what David and I really wanted to highlight in our book, and that's austerity kills. And to end on the point that Aditya made in his article this week on austerity, is that when we look at turning a new corner and thinking about alternatives to austerity. When it comes to the actual nth hour of the Conservative Party, it won't be Brexit. The demise of the Conservative Party will not be Brexit, it will be austerity because of the death and destruction in which it's caused. And I'll end there on that upbeat note.